James was a hard-working and talented chef, known for his passion and creativity in the kitchen. He had spent years perfecting his craft at the Grand Epicurean, a prestigious restaurant where he felt at home. For years, he had built his reputation with dedication, putting heart and soul into every dish he made. But everything changed when the restaurant brought in a new head chef, Mr. Anderson, a man with a sharp suit and an even sharper attitude. One day, out of nowhere, James found himself being dismissed. No explanation, no reason, just a cold decision that left him stunned. After all those years of loyal service, it was a harsh blow. Months passed, and James couldn't shake the bitterness of how things ended. He had loved that place, loved the food, and loved making people happy with his cooking. The sting of unfairness gnawed at him daily. But life moved on, and so did James. Then, 6 months after being let go, James decided to return to the Grand Epicurean. But not to beg for his job back. No, he had a different plan, something that would leave everyone in the room utterly speechless. The day he walked back into the restaurant, everything seemed the same. The polished floors, the bustling kitchen, the familiar smell of sauces and roasting meats. James had always been comfortable in this environment. His hands, dark and calloused from years of cooking, knew every detail of how things worked in that kitchen. It was a part of him, like an extension of his very being. James Brown, Sophie, one of the young line cooks, called out, grinning. "You've got a gift, chef. That special tonight is something else. You've outdone yourself again." James smiled back at her, his brown eyes crinkling in the corners. "Thanks, Sophie. But remember, it's a team effort. We all make the magic happen here." Though he was engaged in conversation, his mind wandered to the dream he held onto for years, opening his own restaurant. He could picture it clearly, a warm, inviting space, filled with laughter and people enjoying the meals he created. The thought filled him with hope, driving him forward even through the tough days. Just as his thoughts wandered, Madame Beaumont, one of the restaurant's regulars, popped her head into the kitchen. Her eyes lit up the moment she spotted James. "There he is!" she exclaimed. "The wizard of flavors himself. James, darling, your lobster bisque was absolutely divine. I had to come back and tell you in person." James felt a flush of pride warming his face. "Thank you, Madame Beaumont. I'm so glad you enjoyed it." He knew this was why he loved cooking. It was about more than just food. It was about the joy it brought to others, the way a perfectly crafted dish could brighten someone's day. That was what made all the hard work worth it. As she left, James found his mind swimming with new ideas for future dishes. He grabbed a ripe tomato and, with care, began slicing it, his thoughts buzzing with the possibilities of what he could create in his own space. "One day," he whispered to himself, "one day this will be mine." That dream felt closer now than ever, just like the vibrant flavors he played with in the kitchen. He could almost taste success. But the atmosphere changed when Mr. Anderson, the new head chef, walked into the kitchen. His presence alone brought a chill to the room. The clacking of his polished shoes echoed on the tiled floor as he made his way through, his crisp white chef's coat a stark contrast to his cold and distant demeanor. James, trying to remain professional, stood up tall. His heart raced, not out of fear, but with a mix of anticipation and nerves. Today, he had prepared his signature dish, something he was proud of, hoping it would impress the new boss. "Mr. Anderson," James greeted him, extending his hand. "I'm James Brown. It's a pleasure to meet you." Mr. Anderson didn't bother shaking his hand. Instead, his cold eyes swept over James, lingering briefly on his dark skin before turning to the plate in front of him. "What's this?" Anderson asked, his tone sharp and dismissive. James tried to keep his composure, his smile faltering just a little. "This is my signature dish, sir. It's a fusion of traditional French cuisine with Caribbean flavors. I thought you might like to try it." But Mr. Anderson didn't seem interested. His lip curled in disapproval. "I see," he muttered, barely glancing at the food. "Well, Mr. Brown, I'm not here for experimental dishes. The Grand Epicurean is known for its classic French cuisine, and that's how it will stay." His words hit James like a brick. Without even tasting the dish, Anderson turned away, addressing the rest of the kitchen staff with a lecture about tradition and excellence. James stood frozen in place. The excitement and hope he had felt just moments ago drained from him. He watched as his carefully crafted dish sat, untouched, growing cold. He couldn't help but wonder if Anderson's rejection was about more than just the food. As the other chefs listened to Mr. Anderson's speech, James quietly cleared away his untouched plate, feeling the weight of unfairness settle in his chest once again. James tried to push Mr. Anderson's harsh words out of his mind, but the cold, dismissive look in the new chef's eyes lingered. For the first time since he'd started working at the Grand Epicurean, James felt like a stranger in the kitchen he had once loved. The sense of belonging he had built over the years seemed to slip away. In the days following Mr. Anderson's arrival, the atmosphere in the kitchen began to shift. It wasn't an immediate, obvious change, but James couldn't help noticing the small adjustments to his schedule. Suddenly, he found himself assigned to more lunch shifts instead of the lively dinner service he enjoyed. It felt like a quiet demotion. One afternoon, while preparing for the lunch rush, James overheard Mr. Anderson speaking to another chef. "We need to stick to traditional flavors. No more of this fusion nonsense," Mr. Anderson said in a dismissive tone. James's heart sank, but he kept his head down and continued working. He tried to suggest ideas during menu planning, but each time, Mr. Anderson either cut him off mid-sentence or ignored his input entirely. It was becoming clear that Mr. Anderson had little interest in what James had to offer. Later that day, as James and Sarah, one of the line cooks, were cleaning up after the shift, she hesitated before speaking up. "James, have you noticed how Mr. Anderson's been treating you lately?" she asked, concern clear in her voice. A lump formed in James's throat, but he forced a smile. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said, trying to sound optimistic. "He's just settling in, you know." Sarah frowned, not convinced. "It doesn't seem right. You're one of our best chefs." "Thanks, Sarah," James replied, touched by her concern. "But don't worry about me. Things will work out." But as the days passed, more of James's colleagues began to express their worries. They saw how Mr. Anderson dismissed James's ideas and kept him away from the most important dishes. Despite the growing unease in his stomach, James tried to stay positive. He threw himself into his work, putting care and passion into every dish, even if it was just a simple lunch salad. "My work will speak for itself," James reminded himself each morning as he tied on his apron. "I just need to keep doing my best." But his resolve was starting to wear thin. Every time Mr. Anderson praised another chef for a dish that lacked creativity, James couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration. It was as if no matter how hard he worked, his efforts would never be enough to please the new head chef. One night, during a bustling dinner service, the kitchen was in full swing. The clatter of pans, the chopping of vegetables, and the hum of conversation filled the air as the team worked together in perfect harmony. James was at his station, carefully plating his signature dish, a modern twist on coq au vin. He had been perfecting this dish for years, and it was one of the restaurant's most popular offerings. As James put the finishing touches on the plate, Mr. Anderson approached, his eyes narrowed as he inspected the dish. "What is this?" Mr. Anderson demanded, his voice cutting through the noise of the kitchen. Pride filled James as he answered, "It's my take on coq au vin, sir. The customers love it." But Mr. Anderson's face twisted in disgust. "This is not coq au vin. This is an abomination," he snapped. The kitchen fell silent. All eyes turned toward James and Mr. Anderson. James could feel the weight of their stares as Mr. Anderson continued his tirade. "But sir," James began, trying to keep his voice steady despite the hurt welling up inside him. "I've been making this dish for years. It's one of our most popular." "I don't care how popular it is," Mr. Anderson interrupted, his voice rising. "This is not what we serve at the Grand Epicurean. This is a respectable French restaurant, not some trendy fusion cafe." James felt his face grow hot as Mr. Anderson berated him in front of the entire staff. He noticed the sympathetic looks from his colleagues, the shock on the newer chefs' faces. The humiliation stung, but something deeper began to stir within him. As Mr. Anderson's rant continued, James started to see beyond the words. He noticed how Mr. Anderson's eyes never fully met his, and how his gestures seemed exaggerated, almost like a performance. It was as if Mr. Anderson wasn't just criticizing the food. He was making a point, but not about the dish itself. Suddenly, the realization hit James like a blow. This wasn't just about his cooking. Mr. Anderson's constant dismissal of his ideas, the way he was slowly being pushed aside, it was all part of something larger, something James had hoped he would never have to face in the kitchen he once called home. As Mr. Anderson stormed off, leaving James standing alone with his abomination of a dish, a mix of emotions flooded through him. Anger, hurt, and disappointment swirled inside. But beneath it all, a fierce determination began to take hold. He wasn't going to let Mr. Anderson define him or his talent. That night when James returned home, his shoulders were slumped and his eyes heavy with worry. As he walked through the door, the comforting aroma of Amy's homemade lasagna filled the air, but even the promise of his favorite meal couldn't lift his spirits. Amy emerged from the kitchen, her warm smile fading as she saw the distress written all over her husband's face. "James, what's wrong, honey?" she asked softly. James sank into a chair at the dining table, his head heavy with frustration as he rubbed a hand over his face. His voice barely rose above a whisper when he finally spoke. "It's Mr. Anderson," he said, his words carrying the weight of exhaustion. "Things at the restaurant are just getting worse." Amy, his wife, sat beside him, taking his hand gently in hers. "Tell me everything," she urged softly, her eyes full of concern. With a deep sigh, James recounted the events of the night. The public humiliation at the hands of Mr. Anderson, the shocked faces of his coworkers, and the growing tension that seemed to smother the kitchen. As he spoke, his voice trembled, a mixture of anger and hurt lacing his words. I think it's because I'm black," James finally admitted, his eyes meeting Amy's. "I'm the only black chef in that kitchen, and Mr. Anderson treats me differently. It feels like he's looking for reasons to push me out." Amy's grip tightened on his hand, her eyes shimmering with empathy and an unmistakable protectiveness. "Oh, James," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. But you listen to me," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You are incredibly talented. Your food is amazing, and you have every right to be in that kitchen." James nodded, drawing strength from her words. "I know, but sometimes I wonder if it's worth fighting for." "It is," Amy insisted firmly. "You've worked too hard to get where you are. Don't let Mr. Anderson's prejudice take that away from you." She cupped his face in her hands, locking eyes with him. "You are strong, James Brown. You're not just a great chef. You're a good man with a beautiful heart. That's worth more than any fancy title or restaurant." A small smile tugged at the corners of James's lips. "What would I do without you?" he murmured. Amy leaned in and kissed his forehead softly. "You'll never have to find out. We're in this together, remember? Now, let's eat some lasagna and figure out how we're going to show Mr. Anderson just how wrong he is." As they settled in for dinner, James felt a renewed sense of determination. With Amy by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead at the Grand Epicurean. In the days that followed, Mr. Anderson's treatment of James became even more blatant. The tension in the kitchen thickened like an over-reduced sauce, heavy and suffocating. One morning, James arrived at work to find the other chefs huddled around Mr. Anderson, discussing the upcoming week's menu. As James approached, the conversation abruptly halted, and the familiar coldness from Mr. Anderson set in. Mr. Anderson's eyes flickered over James before he turned back to the group. "As I was saying," he continued, ignoring James, "we'll be featuring a new tasting menu next week. I've already assigned the dishes to each of you." James cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Excuse me, Mr. Anderson. What would you like me to prepare?" Mr. Anderson's lip curled in a slight smirk. "Oh, James, I didn't see you there," he said with false politeness. "You can continue at your usual station. We won't be needing your creative input for this menu." The words stung, like salt rubbed into an open wound. James looked around the kitchen, searching for any sign of support, but instead, his colleagues avoided his gaze, shuffling uncomfortably. The once lively camaraderie he shared with them had faded, leaving him feeling more isolated with each passing day. As the week went on, James found himself increasingly sidelined. Important meetings about menu changes or VIP events always seemed to take place when he wasn't around. His suggestions were routinely dismissed, his voice barely acknowledged. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It felt like an intentional effort to push him out. What hurt the most, though, was the distance that had grown between him and the other chefs. The people he had once considered friends now barely met his eyes. Conversations would fall silent when he walked into the break room, only to resume in hushed whispers once he left. It was as if they were all too afraid to be associated with him. One afternoon, while grabbing ingredients from the walk-in fridge, James overheard two of his colleagues whispering. "I feel bad for James," one of them said quietly. "But what can we do? If we stick up for him, we might be next on Mr. Anderson's chopping block." "I know," the other replied with a sigh. "It's not right, but I can't afford to lose this job. I've got a family to support." James quietly stepped away from the fridge, his heart sinking. He understood their fear, but the realization that he was now fighting this battle alone weighed heavily on him. The night of the high-profile event finally arrived, and the Grand Epicurean buzzed with excitement. The restaurant was packed with the city's elite, food critics, celebrities, and influential business leaders. It was the perfect opportunity for James to showcase his culinary talents and prove his worth. But, as always, Mr. Anderson had other plans. Instead of giving James the chance to shine, Mr. Anderson made sure to keep him far from the spotlight. While the other chefs were busy preparing intricate dishes for the event, James was relegated to simple tasks that didn't match his expertise or passion. It was another silent blow, another reminder that no matter how hard he worked, Mr. Anderson would always try to hold him back. But as James watched the night unfold, a fire started to burn in his chest. He was tired of being pushed aside, tired of being ignored, and tired of letting someone like Mr. Anderson define his worth. He knew he deserved better, and he was going to prove it, no matter what it took. James felt a lump form in his throat as he stood at the sink, scrubbing pots and pans. The clatter of silverware and the chatter of guests filled the air, mingling with the enticing aroma of the dishes he had helped create. But instead of being in the middle of the action, crafting the meals he was so passionate about, James had been reduced to washing dishes on one of the most important nights of the year. Earlier in the evening, during the pre-service meeting, Mr. Anderson had handed out assignments with a smug gleam in his eye. "Pierre, you'll be handling appetizers. Sarah, you're in charge of main courses. And James," Mr. Anderson had paused, as if savoring the moment, "you'll be on dish duty and prep work tonight." Dish duty? On a night like this? The words hit James like a slap. He opened his mouth to protest, to remind Mr. Anderson of all the work he had done developing the evening's special menu. But before he could speak, Mr. Anderson had moved on, completely disregarding him. With a heavy heart, James had accepted his role for the night. He worked diligently, scrubbing each pot until it shined, and making sure every vegetable was diced to perfection. But as he worked, he couldn't ignore the gnawing frustration inside him. Through the clattering of plates and the hum of the kitchen, James heard Mr. Anderson in the dining room, accepting compliments from guests for dishes James had conceptualized. The seared scallops with truffle foam, one of James's proudest creations, was being lauded by a food critic, and there was Mr. Anderson, taking full credit. "Yes, a personal creation," Mr. Anderson boasted to the critic, not even mentioning James's name. The injustice burned, but James kept his head down and continued his work. Even as Mr. Anderson paraded through the dining room, basking in praise that wasn't his to claim, James made sure every task he did was done with care. He wouldn't let his frustration diminish his professionalism. Still, the unfairness gnawed at him, and by the end of the night, James's determination had only grown stronger. He knew he couldn't let Mr. Anderson continue treating him this way. Something had to change. The next day, James arrived at the restaurant early, his mind set on confronting Mr. Anderson. He couldn't allow the blatant discrimination to continue unchecked. As the kitchen staff buzzed around, preparing for the day's service, James took a deep breath and approached Mr. Anderson, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mr. Anderson, may I have a word with you?" James asked, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. Mr. Anderson turned, raising an eyebrow in surprise. "What is it, James? We're quite busy, as you can see." James stood his ground. "I think it's important we discuss this now, sir." The kitchen quieted as the tension in the room grew thick. All eyes turned to James and Mr. Anderson, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Very well," Mr. Anderson said, his tone clipped. "Speak your mind." James took another deep breath, steadying himself. "Mr. Anderson, I've noticed a pattern in how I'm being treated here. I believe I'm facing discrimination because of my race." A collective gasp rippled through the kitchen, and the staff exchanged uneasy glances. Mr. Anderson's face reddened, his eyes narrowing. "That's a very serious accusation, James," Mr. Anderson said, his voice dangerously low. "What makes you think that?" James's voice grew stronger as he continued. "You've been consistently undermining my work, sir. You've given me less important tasks, ignored my input, and even taken credit for dishes that I created. I'm the only black chef in this kitchen, and I'm the only one being treated this way." The kitchen staff shuffled uncomfortably, some nodding in quiet agreement, while others avoided eye contact, ashamed they hadn't spoken up sooner. James could feel the weight of their unspoken support. Mr. Anderson's face contorted with anger. "How dare you make such claims?" he spat. "I've done nothing but uphold the high standards of this restaurant. If you can't handle the pressure, perhaps you're not cut out for this kitchen." James stood firm, unflinching. "I can handle the pressure, sir. What I can't handle is unfair treatment. I'm a skilled chef, and I deserve the same respect and opportunities as everyone else here." The tension in the kitchen was palpable. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see how the confrontation would end. Mr. Anderson's face turned a deeper shade of red, his fists clenched at his sides. The silence stretched on, the only sound the faint clattering of silverware in the dining room. "That's enough," Mr. Anderson bellowed, his voice echoing off the steel surfaces. "I will not stand here and be accused of discrimination in my own kitchen." James didn't back down. "I'm simply asking for fair treatment." "Fair treatment?" Mr. Anderson scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'll show you fair treatment. You're fired. Pack your things and get out of my kitchen immediately." A shocked gasp rippled through the room. James felt as if the air had been knocked out of him. His head spun as the reality of what just happened hit him. He had known this was a risk, but hearing those words still cut deep. "You can't do that," one of the sous chefs whispered, their voice barely audible. But Mr. Anderson silenced them with a sharp look, his authority unwavering. James took a deep breath, fighting back the sting of tears that threatened to surface. He looked around the kitchen at the faces of his colleagues, some filled with sympathy, others avoiding his gaze entirely. "Very well," James said, his voice calm despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He untied his apron and placed it on the counter, feeling the weight of the moment. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind the place that had once felt like home, now tainted by the actions of one man's prejudice. But as James stepped outside, the fresh air hit his face, and he realized something. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Mr. Anderson's words and actions might have stung, but they wouldn't define him or his future. He still had his passion for cooking, his talent, and the unwavering support of Amy. And that was more than enough. James stood silently at his locker, carefully gathering his belongings while the kitchen buzzed with an uncomfortable silence. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words and the stares of his colleagues. As he untied his apron, he did so with as much dignity as he could manage, refusing to let his emotions show. Placing it on the counter, he walked through the kitchen one last time, his eyes catching the dish he had worked on earlier, now left abandoned and cold. It was a symbol of his passion, the craft he had dedicated himself to for years. With one last glance at the kitchen, the place that had once been his second home, he pushed open the door and walked out. The heavy door shut behind him with a final thud, sealing off a chapter of his life. James stepped into the crisp morning air, the reality of what had just happened slowly settling in. His career at the Grand Epicurean was over, and with it, the job he had poured his heart and soul into. It was gone just like that, As he walked to his car, his mind raced. What would he tell Amy and their children? How would he support them now? His future felt uncertain, and the weight of it all pressed down on him, making each step feel heavier than the last. A few weeks later, James stood outside yet another restaurant, staring at the no hiring sign in the window. His shoulders slumped in defeat, the sign mocking him after countless rejections. It was like a cruel joke, a constant reminder of how difficult things had become. He clutched his resume tightly in his hand, feeling the sting of frustration and exhaustion. This can't be happening, he muttered under his breath, his voice lost amid the noise of the bustling city street. Job hunting had become a daily grind, and with each rejection, James could feel his confidence slipping further away. The bills at home were piling up, and though Amy had been incredibly supportive, he could see the worry etched in her face every time he came home empty-handed. He needed work and fast. The next morning, as James walked through his neighborhood, he found himself staring at a small, local diner on the corner. The faded help wanted sign in the window seemed to be calling him. With a heavy heart, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The diner owner, a kind-faced woman named Betty, glanced at his resume and smiled sympathetically. "You're overqualified for this, you know," she said, her voice gentle. "But if you want the job, it's yours." James swallowed his pride, nodding. "I'll take it. Thank you." The following week, James found himself behind the counter of the diner, flipping burgers and making sandwiches. It wasn't the kind of cooking he was used to. It was a far cry from the gourmet dishes he had once been so proud to create. But James, always a professional, threw himself into the work with the same determination that had fueled him in the finest kitchens. "Order up," James called, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon across the counter. The customer, a regular named Joe, took a bite and grinned. "Best eggs I've had here in years," Joe said, giving James a thumbs up. The compliment warmed James's heart, but it wasn't enough to fill the void left by the absence of creative challenge. He missed the artistry of fine dining, the way he could craft flavors and experiment with dishes. Still, during his breaks, he would pull out a small notebook and jot down recipe ideas, determined not to let his skills fade. One quiet afternoon, Betty caught James experimenting in the kitchen, mixing up a new sauce for the meatloaf special with the limited ingredients the diner had on hand. "That smells amazing," Betty said, her eyes wide with surprise. James smiled, sheepishly stirring the sauce. "Just trying something new." In that moment, as the familiar scent of cooking filled the air, James felt a spark of his old passion return. He might be in a small diner now, but the love he had for his craft wasn't gone. He was determined to find his way back to the world of fine dining, no matter how long it took. A few days later, James was wiping down the counter, lost in thought about his next shift, when the bell above the diner door chimed. A woman in her mid-40s stepped in, scanning the room as if looking for someone. "Can I help you?" James asked, his voice polite but curious. The woman's face lit up when she saw him. "Are you James Brown?" she asked excitedly. Surprised, James nodded. "Yes, that's me." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Sarah, from the Oakwood Community Center. I've heard wonderful things about your cooking." James shook her hand, a mix of curiosity and caution in his eyes. "Thank you. What can I do for you?" "We're organizing a charity cook-off next month to raise funds for our after-school programs, and we'd love for you to participate," Sarah explained, her smile warm and inviting. James's heart skipped a beat at the mention of a cook-off. The opportunity stirred something deep within him, but doubt quickly followed. "I appreciate the offer," he said hesitantly, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person for this." "Nonsense," Sarah insisted. "Your reputation precedes you. Having you there would really draw attention to our cause." James hesitated, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. The idea of cooking in a competitive setting again excited him, but at the same time, he felt the weight of his recent failures. Was he still good enough? "Can I think about it?" he asked, unsure. "Of course," Sarah replied, handing him a flyer. "We'd be honored to have you." That evening, James sat at the kitchen table, the flyer for the charity cook-off lying in front of him. He stared at it in silence, lost in thought. Amy, sensing his distraction, joined him at the table, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What's on your mind, honey?" she asked gently. James sighed deeply, explaining the offer from Sarah. I don't know if I should do it. What if I'm not good enough anymore? Amy looked at him, her eyes full of love and confidence. James, you're an incredible chef. You've always been good enough. You just need to believe it again. Amy held James's hand, her gaze unwavering and full of love. James, your talent didn't disappear just because you're working at a diner. This is a great opportunity. James hesitated. But what if? No what ifs, Amy cut him off firmly. You're an amazing chef, and this is your chance to remind everyone, including yourself, of that fact. A small smile formed on James's lips. You really think I should do it? Absolutely, Amy replied with conviction. And I'll be right there, cheering you on every step of the way. The next day, James's friend and former colleague, Tom, came by the diner for lunch. When James mentioned the charity cook-off, Tom's face lit up with excitement. Man, you have to do it, Tom exclaimed. Show everyone what they've been missing out on. James felt the spark of excitement building in his chest. The thought of creating something special, something that truly represented his passion, was becoming more appealing by the minute. You know what? James said, newfound determination in his voice. I think I will. That evening, James stood in his small kitchen at home, surrounded by a variety of ingredients. The countertops were cluttered with spices, fresh produce, and utensils. Taking a deep breath, he inhaled the familiar scents that had always brought him comfort. As he began chopping vegetables, he felt a spark of excitement that had been missing for months. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board was like music to his ears, and before he knew it, he was humming softly, a smile dancing on his lips. His thoughts drifted to memories of his grandmother's cooking. He recalled the rich, hearty flavors of her gumbo and how she had lovingly taught him her secret techniques in the kitchen. Feeling inspired, James decided to create a dish that paid homage to his roots while adding his own modern twist. Hours flew by as he experimented with different flavor combinations, tasting and adjusting, refining his creation until it was just right. The kitchen was soon filled with mouth-watering aromas, prompting Amy to peek in. Smells amazing in here, she said, her eyes sparkling as she saw her husband engrossed in his craft once again. James beamed with pride. I think I've got something special here, Amy. Want to try it? Amy took a bite, her eyes widening in surprise. Oh, James, she said, her voice soft with amazement. This is incredible. Her reaction warmed James's heart in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. He had missed this feeling, the satisfaction of creating something truly delicious, something that could bring joy to others. It was a reminder of why he had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. In the days leading up to the cook-off, James continued to perfect his dish. He would wake up early, jotting down ideas that came to him in his dreams. During his shifts at the diner, he scribbled flavor combinations on napkins, eager to test them out when he got home. With each new idea, his confidence grew. The self-doubt that had weighed him down since losing his job at the Grand Epicurean slowly faded, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. As James stood in his kitchen, putting the finishing touches on his dish, he realized something deeply profound. Cooking wasn't just his job, it was a part of him. No matter what happened in his career, this passion would always be there, waiting to be reignited whenever he needed it. The day of the charity cook-off finally arrived. James woke up early, his heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and excitement. He carefully packed his ingredients and equipment, double-checking everything before heading out. When he entered the bustling community center, he was immediately struck by the vibrant energy in the room. The air buzzed with the sounds of sizzling pans, chopping knives, and the excited chatter of competitors and spectators alike. Competitors from all backgrounds were setting up their stations, each determined to impress the judges and the crowd. James took a deep breath, his nerves settling as he began to arrange his ingredients with care. His hands moved with the practiced precision of a seasoned chef, and soon, a calm sense of purpose washed over him. He realized, once again, that this was where he belonged. As the competition began, James lost himself in the rhythm of cooking. His movements were graceful, his confidence shining through with every dish he prepared. The aromas drifting from his station attracted curious onlookers, who watched in awe as he expertly combined ingredients and flavors in ways they hadn't expected. When the judges finally made their rounds, James presented his dishes with a deep sense of pride. He shared the inspiration behind each creation, talking about his grandmother's influence and his personal journey through the culinary world. The judges listened intently, their eyes widening as they tasted the food before them. "This is remarkable," one of the judges said, clearly impressed by the complexity and balance of flavors. Another judge nodded in agreement, savoring each bite. "It's a perfect blend of tradition and innovation." As James stood before them, a sense of fulfillment filled his heart. It wasn't just about the competition anymore. It was about rediscovering his love for cooking and reminding himself of his own worth. This was the path he was meant to walk, and nothing, not Mr. Anderson's prejudice, not the setbacks he'd faced, could take that away from him. James's eyes lit up as he considered Amy's suggestion. "Roots and wings," he repeated softly, letting the name sink in. It was perfect. It symbolized everything he wanted his restaurant to be, grounded in his heritage, yet daring enough to explore new culinary possibilities. "I love it," James said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's exactly what I want to do. Honor where I've come from, but also push myself to create something new and extraordinary." Amy smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I knew you'd like it. It's who you are, James." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. James and Amy immersed themselves in planning every detail, from the layout of the kitchen to the potential dishes that would grace the menu. They spent hours poring over ideas, refining recipes, and dreaming about the future. James was determined to make the most of the opportunity Evelyn Foster had offered him, and he threw himself into the work with the same passion that had driven him in his early days as a chef. Evelyn had kept her word, and true to her promise, she connected James with several industry insiders who were eager to help him bring his vision to life. With her guidance and support, James began to see his dream turning into a reality. One evening, as James and Amy sat at their kitchen table, going over the final details, James paused and looked at his wife. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've always believed in me, even when I wasn't sure I believed in myself." Amy smiled warmly. "That's because I know who you are, James. You have something special, and the world deserves to see it." James reached across the table, taking her hand. "This restaurant isn't just for me," he said quietly. "It's for us, for our family, and for everyone who believes in what I can do." A few months later, the grand opening of Roots and Wings was upon them. The once distant dream had now come to life, and the small restaurant was buzzing with excitement. Friends, family, and industry professionals filled the space, eager to taste the food that had been garnering so much attention. James stood in the kitchen, taking a deep breath as he prepared to serve the first dishes of the evening. His hands moved with a steady confidence, the rhythm of cooking coming as naturally to him as breathing. The dishes he plated were a reflection of his journey, traditional flavors with modern twists, a celebration of his roots and his growth as a chef. Each dish told a story, and as they left the kitchen, James couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. The response from the guests was immediate. Words of praise filled the dining room as people savored each bite, and James could hear the excited chatter from the kitchen. It was everything he had dreamed of and more. As the evening progressed, James took a moment to step out into the dining room. He looked around, his heart swelling with emotion as he saw the smiles on people's faces, the way they enjoyed the food he had created. This was why he cooked, to share his passion, to bring joy to others through his craft. Evelyn Foster approached him, a glass of wine in hand and a satisfied smile on her face. "Mr. Brown," she said, raising her glass, "you've done it. You've created something truly extraordinary." James smiled, his heart full. "Thank you, Miss Foster. I couldn't have done it without your support." Evelyn shook her head. "All I did was open a door, James. You're the one who walked through it." As the night came to a close, James stood in the middle of the restaurant, taking it all in. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but standing there, surrounded by the people who believed in him, he knew it had all been worth it. Amy walked up to him, slipping her hand into his. "Look at what you've accomplished," she said softly. "You did it, James." He looked down at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We did it," he corrected. "This is just the beginning." And as the lights dimmed and the last guest left, James knew that Roots and Wings would be more than just a restaurant. It would be a place where stories were told through food, where his heritage and passion could soar. It was the beginning of something beautiful, and for the first time in a long time, James felt completely at peace, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. As James and Amy continued working on their plans, James felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The bitterness and pain from his dismissal at the Grand Epicurean began to fade, replaced by a growing excitement for the future. With Amy's unwavering support and Evelyn's guidance, James felt unstoppable, like the world was finally opening up to him. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, James reflected on his journey. "You know," he began softly, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm almost grateful for what happened with Mr. Anderson. If I hadn't been fired, I might never have had this opportunity." Amy smiled and gently squeezed his hand. "You've always had the talent, James. Now the world is finally going to see it." Evelyn Foster's reputation in the culinary world had opened doors James could have only dreamed of. She had arranged a meeting with potential investors at a sleek, modern downtown office. Standing in front of a group of well-dressed business people, James felt a wave of nerves. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his portfolio, but he took a deep breath and steadied himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evelyn began, her voice both warm and commanding, "I'd like to introduce you to James Brown, a chef with extraordinary talent and vision." James began to speak, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. He shared his journey, his passion for cooking, and his vision for a restaurant that honored his roots while pushing culinary boundaries. As he spoke, he could see the curiosity and interest growing in the investors' eyes. One of the investors, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, leaned forward, her voice full of encouragement. "Mr. Brown, your passion is evident. Tell us more about your concept." James's face lit up as he explained his vision for Roots and Wings. "It's a fusion of traditional soul food with modern techniques," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "I want to create dishes that remind people of home, but also surprise them with new flavors they've never experienced before." The investors nodded approvingly, and by the end of the meeting, they agreed to provide the funding James needed to bring his dream to life. As they walked out of the office, Evelyn squeezed James's shoulder. "You did it, James. Your dream is becoming a reality." Over the next few weeks, James threw himself into planning. His small home kitchen became a hub of creativity, filled with the smells of his culinary experiments. Amy often found him working late at night, surrounded by pots and pans, his brow furrowed in concentration as he perfected his recipes. "Try this," he said one evening, offering her a spoonful of a rich, fragrant stew. "It's my grandmother's recipe, but I've added my own twist." Amy's eyes widened as she tasted it. "James, this is amazing." James grinned, his heart swelling with pride. He knew he was on the right path. Each dish he created was a reflection of his story, a blend of his past, his roots, and his hopes for the future. Roots and Wings wasn't just a restaurant. It was a personal expression of everything he loved about food and cooking. As word spread through the city's culinary scene about James's comeback, the excitement built. Former colleagues and patrons from the Grand Epicurean heard about his new venture, and the news traveled quickly. Many were delighted to hear that James was making a triumphant return to the restaurant world. One afternoon, as James was reviewing potential locations for Roots and Wings, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Sophie, a sous chef he had worked closely with at the Grand Epicurean. "James, I just heard about your new restaurant. I'm so happy for you. You deserve this chance to shine." James smiled warmly as he read the message. He hadn't realized how much he missed the camaraderie of his old kitchen team. Throughout the day, more messages poured in from other former colleagues, line cooks, servers, even the pastry chef who had always admired James's creativity. The outpouring of support filled him with joy and reminded him of the impact he had made, even during the challenging times. Later that week, while James was grocery shopping for ingredients to test new recipes, he unexpectedly bumped into Mr. and Mrs. Goldstein, longtime regulars from the Grand Epicurean. The elderly couple's faces lit up the moment they recognized him. "James!" Mrs. Goldstein exclaimed, her eyes twinkling with delight. "We've missed you. The Grand Epicurean hasn't been the same since you left." Mr. Goldstein nodded in agreement. "It's true. No one there quite matches your touch." James smiled, humbled by their kind words. "Thank you both. I'm actually working on something new, a restaurant of my own." Mrs. Goldstein gasped in excitement. "Really? Oh, James, that's wonderful. You have to let us know when it opens. We'll be your first customers." James chuckled. "I'd be honored. I'll make sure to send you an invitation." As he continued his shopping, James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. The support from his old patrons, colleagues, and now investors gave him the strength to push forward. Roots and Wings was becoming more than just a dream. It was becoming a reality, and James knew it would be something truly special. "James, my dear boy," Mrs. Goldstein exclaimed, her eyes twinkling with joy as she spotted him. "We've missed your wonderful dishes. Is it true you're opening your own place?" James nodded, a shy smile spreading across his face. "Yes, ma'am. It's called Roots and Wings. I'm hoping to open in a few months." Mr. Goldstein clapped him on the back. "We'll be first in line, son. Your food always at heart. It'll be good to taste it again." Their words stayed with James long after they parted ways. The warmth and encouragement from the Goldsteins, as well as the support from his former colleagues, filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. Despite all the obstacles he had faced, James realized that his cooking had made a lasting impact on people. His food had left an impression, and that was something worth holding on to. As James continued working on his restaurant plans, he received an unexpected email from Jean-Luc, the head sommelier at the Grand Epicurean. In it, Jean-Luc offered to help James curate a wine list for Roots and Wings that would perfectly complement his unique menu. James was touched by the gesture. It showed him that even though he was no longer at the Grand Epicurean, he still had allies in the culinary world who believed in him. Construction on Roots and Wings soon began, and James found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. Each day brought new decisions and fresh challenges, but for James, each obstacle was an opportunity to pour his heart and soul into his dream. From dawn to well past sunset, James was on site, overseeing every aspect of the restaurant's creation. He worked closely with the architects and designers to ensure that the space reflected the warmth and creativity of his cuisine. "I want the dining room to feel like home," James explained to the interior designer, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "But also like an adventure. Can we mix warm wood tones with bright pops of color?" The designer nodded, furiously taking notes as James described his vision. Together, they selected rich mahogany tables and vibrant, African-inspired artwork for the walls, creating a space that was both inviting and inspiring. James wanted every detail of the restaurant to tell a story, from the decor to the dishes. In the kitchen, James was even more hands-on. He meticulously selected each piece of equipment, from state-of-the-art ovens to handcrafted chef's knives. "This isn't just about cooking," James told Amy one evening as they reviewed the kitchen plans. "It's about creating an experience. Every dish that leaves this kitchen will carry a piece of my story." But bringing his vision to life wasn't without its challenges. Construction delays threatened to push back the opening date, and unexpected costs began to eat into their budget. James often found himself up late at night, poring over spreadsheets and making tough decisions. One particularly stressful day, when a shipment of kitchen tiles arrived damaged, James felt the weight of his dream pressing down on him. Doubts began creeping in, whispering that maybe he had bitten off more than he could chew. Just then, his phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn Foster. "How's it going, chef? Can't wait to see what you're cooking up." Those simple words of encouragement were enough to reignite James's determination. He squared his shoulders and dove back into the work, tackling each challenge with renewed vigor. As the weeks passed, James's dedication began to pay off. The restaurant slowly transformed from a construction site into a warm, inviting space that perfectly captured his culinary vision. The excitement surrounding the opening of Roots and Wings was palpable. Word of James's new venture had spread through the city's culinary scene, and food enthusiasts eagerly awaited the chance to experience the flavors and stories he would bring to the table. Meanwhile, across town, the Grand Epicurean was facing a different kind of buzz. The once bustling restaurant now stood eerily quiet on most nights. Mr. Anderson paced the kitchen, his face etched with worry as he surveyed the half-empty dining room. "Where are all our regulars?" he muttered to the sous chef, who could only shrug in response. The absence of James's innovative dishes had left a noticeable gap in the menu. Patrons who once raved about the restaurant's unique fusion of flavors now complained about the bland and uninspired offerings. Mr. Anderson's insistence on sticking to traditional recipes had failed to excite the palates of the restaurant's increasingly diverse clientele. What once set the restaurant apart now seemed outdated and stagnant. But it wasn't just the food that was driving customers away. The atmosphere at the Grand Epicurean had changed dramatically since James's departure. The camaraderie that had once characterized the kitchen was gone, replaced by a tense and joyless work environment. The staff, who had once been inspired by James's leadership and creativity, now felt stifled under Mr. Anderson's rigid direction. Customers could sense it too, the energy, the warmth, and the heart that had once defined the Grand Epicurean seemed to have disappeared. The restaurant's decline was slow but steady, and Mr. Anderson's refusal to adapt only hastened its downfall. As Roots and Wings neared its grand opening, the contrast between the two restaurants couldn't have been more striking. While the Grand Epicurean struggled to fill its tables, Roots and Wings was poised to become the city's next culinary sensation. James's return to the restaurant scene was no longer just a comeback. It was a statement. James stood at the doorway, his eyes reflecting a mix of empathy and quiet strength as he looked at the man who had once been his superior. Mr. Anderson, sitting alone in his dimly lit office, was a shadow of the confident chef who had ruled the Grand Epicurean's kitchen with an iron fist. The weariness etched on his face and the disarray of his once pristine office told James everything he needed to know. "James, what are you doing here?" Mr. Anderson asked, his voice barely audible. He shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable, hastily wiping his eyes to hide any sign of vulnerability. James took a few steps into the office, his presence both calm and commanding. "I've heard about the restaurant struggles," he said gently, his voice carrying no judgment, only understanding. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of the past. Mr. Anderson's pride, which had driven away his most talented chef, had now brought his once thriving restaurant to its knees. The Grand Epicurean was a ghost of its former self, and it was clear that Mr. Anderson knew it. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Mr. Anderson muttered, his eyes cast down. I thought I was doing what was best for the restaurant. But now," his voice cracked as he gestured around the empty office, the papers strewn across his desk, the mounting bills that marked the slow demise of his business. James could feel the tension in the room, but he also felt a deep sense of compassion for the man in front of him. He hadn't come to gloat or to throw Mr. Anderson's failure in his face. He had come because, despite everything, he understood what it meant to fight for a dream. "We all make mistakes," James said softly, his gaze steady. "But the important thing is what we do next." Mr. Anderson looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. He had expected anger, maybe even vengeance, but not this. Not understanding. Not forgiveness. "I don't know what to do anymore," Mr. Anderson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've lost everything." James shook his head. "You haven't lost everything. But you do need to change. The way you treated me, the way you ran this place, it's not sustainable. You pushed away the people who could have helped you succeed." Mr. Anderson nodded slowly, unable to argue with the truth. The weight of his actions had caught up to him, and now he was left with the fallout. "I've learned that pride can blind you to what's really important," James continued. "I left the Grand Epicurean because I had to, but that decision forced me to grow, to take risks I never thought I'd take. And now, I have roots and wings because I didn't give up. The mention of James's successful restaurant seemed to cut through the tension like a sharp knife. Mr. Anderson couldn't help but think of all the posts he had seen, the glowing reviews, the photos of James smiling in front of a full house. Roots and Wings had become everything the grand Epicurean was supposed to be: vibrant, innovative, and full of heart. "James, I'm sorry," Mr. Anderson said, his voice shaking. "I was wrong. About everything. I should have seen your talent, your potential. I let my pride get in the way, and now look where it's gotten me." James nodded, accepting the apology. It wasn't easy for Mr. Anderson to admit his mistakes, and James could see that. "I didn't come here for an apology," James said. "I came because I believe that every restaurant deserves a second chance, just like people do." Mr. Anderson stared at him, bewildered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to help. Not because I owe you anything, but because I know what this restaurant could be if you're willing to change. The Grand Epicurean doesn't have to close its doors, but you have to be willing to let go of the past." Mr. Anderson blinked, overwhelmed by James's offer. He had expected nothing but resentment from James, but here was the man he had wronged, offering him a lifeline. "You'd help me?" Mr. Anderson asked, disbelief lacing his voice. "I consult," James clarified, his voice firm. "I'm not coming back to run your kitchen, but I can help you rebuild. I can show you how to embrace change, how to create something that people will care about again. But you have to let go of your ego, Mr. Anderson. You can't control everything. Let your staff have a voice. Let them bring their creativity to the table." Mr. Anderson sat back in his chair, absorbing James's words. The offer was humbling, but he knew it was the only chance he had. He had run his restaurant into the ground with his stubbornness and pride, and now, the only person offering him a way out was the chef he had pushed away. "James," Mr. Anderson said slowly, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and regret, "I don't deserve your help, but I'll take it. I'll do whatever it takes to save this place." James nodded, satisfied. "Then let's get to work." And with that, James extended a hand, offering Mr. Anderson not only a chance to save his restaurant, but a chance at redemption. For James, this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring something that had once been great, and in doing so, creating a future where both Roots and Wings and the Grand Epicurean could thrive side by side. Mr. Anderson sat, overwhelmed by the weight of James's unexpected offer. The restaurant he had driven to the brink of collapse. The man he had wronged and dismissed. Now, James was standing in front of him, extending a hand of forgiveness and a future filled with possibility. I have a proposition for you," James said, his voice calm but determined. Mr. Anderson's eyebrows raised in disbelief. After everything that had happened, after all the pain and disrespect he had shown James, this was the last thing he had expected. James took a deep breath, knowing the importance of what he was about to say. "I know we've had our differences, but I believe in second chances. I'm offering to buy the Grand Epicurean and incorporate it into Roots and Wings. You would stay on as a consultant, sharing your expertise and helping to blend the best of both establishments." Stunned silence fell over the room as Mr. Anderson processed James's words. It was an offer he had never thought possible, especially from someone he had wronged so deeply. He could hardly comprehend the kindness, the generosity in James's voice and actions. I don't understand," Mr. Anderson stammered, his voice trembling with emotion. "After everything I did to you, why would you want to help me?" James smiled softly, his eyes filled with compassion and forgiveness. "Because holding on to anger only hurts us both," he replied. "I've learned that forgiveness can be a powerful thing, and the Grand Epicurean has so much potential. It would be a shame to see it close its doors forever. Together, I believe we can breathe new life into it." Mr. Anderson's shoulders sagged as he let out a heavy sigh. He looked around the empty kitchen, remembering the bustling energy that had once filled the space. "But how? The restaurant is failing. It's beyond saving." James shook his head, determination evident in his voice. "No restaurant is beyond saving if you have the right people and the right vision. I see an opportunity here, to to blend the classic techniques that made the Grand Epicurean famous with the innovative approach we've developed at Roots and Wings. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. I'm offering to buy out your share of the restaurant, Mr. Anderson, but I want you to stay on as a consultant. Your experience and knowledge are invaluable. Mr. Anderson's eyes widened. It was more than he had ever hoped for, more than he deserved. A lump formed in his throat as he struggled to find the right words. James, I don't know what to say, he managed, his voice barely a whisper. Your offer is incredibly generous, especially considering our history. James nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. I know it's a lot to take in. Take some time to think about it. But know that this offer comes from a place of respect for what the Grand Epicurean once was, and what it can be again. Mr. Anderson looked down at his hands, then back up at James. In that moment, he saw not just a talented chef, but a man of immense character, grace, and humility. Humbled and grateful, he made his decision. I accept your offer, James, he said, his voice filled with relief and gratitude. Thank you for giving me, and the Grand Epicurean, a second chance. With the sale finalized, James and Mr. Anderson stood together in the quiet kitchen of the Grand Epicurean. The once bustling space was now a stark reminder of how far the restaurant had fallen, but also how far it could rise again. James took a deep breath, scanning the familiar surroundings, feeling both nostalgia and excitement. Mr. Anderson, James began, his voice steady, I have another proposition for you. Mr. Anderson looked up, his curiosity and apprehension evident. Yes, James smiled softly. I'd like to offer you the position of head chef here at the Grand Epicurean. Mr. Anderson's eyes widened in surprise. Head chef? But after everything? James raised a hand gently, interrupting him. The past is behind us. What matters now is the future of this restaurant. Your experience and skill are invaluable, and I believe you can play a crucial role in its revival. He paused, his expression growing serious. But I want to be clear about something. This restaurant will be run differently from now on. Our focus will be on inclusivity, respect, and creating a healthy work environment for everyone. Mr. Anderson nodded slowly, absorbing James's words. That means no room for the bias or prejudices that once existed here, James continued. Every member of our team, regardless of their background, will be valued and given equal opportunities to shine. Can you commit to that? Mr. Anderson was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the gleaming countertops. When he looked up again, there were tears in his eyes. James, I don't deserve this kindness, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. James stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. You do, Mr. Anderson. Everyone deserves a second chance, if they're willing to learn from their mistakes. Mr. Anderson nodded, the tears threatening to spill over. I can commit to that, he whispered. James extended his hand, and for the first time in a long while, Mr. Anderson felt a sense of hope. He took James's hand, sealing not just a business agreement, but a partnership built on growth, redemption, and the possibility of a brighter future for them both. Together, they would rebuild the Grand Epicurean, and this time, it would stand stronger than ever. Before the staff erupted into applause, the energy in the kitchen was palpable, filled with a sense of unity and shared pride. James beamed at Mr. Anderson, nodding in approval. It was a far cry from the atmosphere they had once worked in, and seeing Mr. Anderson humble himself in front of the team spoke volumes about how far they had all come. As the applause died down, Samantha, the young chef who had once been intimidated by Mr. Anderson's rigid demeanor, stepped forward. Chef Anderson, she said, her voice soft but confident, we've all noticed how much you've changed, and I just want to say it's been a pleasure working with you. You've taught us so much, and it means a lot. Mr. Anderson's eyes shimmered with emotion. He had never expected such kindness from the staff, especially after the way he had once treated them. Thank you, he managed, his voice thick. It means more than you know. As the team dispersed, returning to clean up after the evening service, James and Mr. Anderson stood together in the corner of the kitchen, watching the staff chat and laugh as they worked. The kitchen, once filled with tension and unease, now buzzed with collaboration and creativity. "You've built something special here," Mr. Anderson said quietly, glancing at James. "This is more than just a restaurant. It's a community." James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was all of us, and that includes you." Mr. Anderson nodded, still somewhat astonished by how far they had come. Working under James had been a humbling experience, but it had also reignited a fire in him that had long been extinguished. He no longer resented James's leadership. Instead, he admired it. James had led by example, showing compassion, patience, and a willingness to embrace change, qualities Mr. Anderson now aspired to embody himself. Over the following months, the Grand Epicurean began to regain its former glory. The fusion of French techniques with flavors from diverse cultures made the restaurant stand out in the city's competitive culinary scene. The seasonal specials that James and Mr. Anderson had introduced brought in new clientele and kept regulars excited about the ever-evolving menu. More importantly, the restaurant had become a place of inclusivity and respect, where chefs from all backgrounds felt valued and empowered to contribute their ideas. It wasn't just the food that had transformed. It was the entire ethos of the establishment. One evening, after a